Hey everyone! I have something different in store for you today, but before I get into it, I'm super happy to announce that this video is sponsored by Skillshare. It's my very first sponsored video, and I'm beyond happy to be able to dedicate more time to my YouTube channel thanks to this sponsorship. So some of you guys might be familiar with the Draw This Again or Redraw challenge. I'm pretty sure it's one of the oldest challenges in the art community. I've seen it around for like years and years, and I've always wanted to give it a shot, but I guess I never really could find the time to do it, or I was too lazy and things always got in the way. But I finally got around to it after looking through some of my old art. So I found this absolute gem while looking through this massive folder of ancient artwork that I have, and something about it just screamed, this is it. And I actually have a lot more similar drawings, but they're hidden elsewhere. Maybe I'll do a video tour specifically from the Sailor Moon obsession era in my art journey someday, because basically that is where it all started. But yeah, I did this little drawing when I was 11, and at the time I was obsessed obviously with Sailor Moon, and specifically I was super into the villain designs because I just found they were so interesting. Like, their costumes were always so different, and they were super fashion heavy. Like, I don't know how to explain it, but there was just always something about Sailor Moon specifically that had such a fashion illustration vibe. I was specifically obsessed with Naoko Takeuchi's illustrations and her sketches and things. They were all traditionally drawn, and I think she used airbrush a lot, and markers I believe, but regardless, those are the drawings that I was absolutely in love with, as well as obviously the manga artwork. And all I ever did was Google the images and save as many as I can and just stare at them. So I'm gonna show you guys a couple of examples of the specific artwork that I'm talking about that really heavily inspired me at the time. And yeah, I mean, honestly, like, even looking at it now makes me so, like, I can't describe this emotion that I get, but it's just so, it aged so well. I feel like the style is so solid. It looks just as beautiful to me now as it did 20 years ago, and which is surprising because a lot of things that I used to like I no longer like, but there's just something so timeless about her style. But yeah, and so I decided to use this drawing as the base for my redraw challenge. And I also decided to try to use my iPad again, Procreate specifically. I did consider doing it traditionally because I have been doing mostly traditional artwork for personal purposes anyways for a while now, but I do have an iPad that I got specifically to try to draw with a couple of years ago actually, that I just never got around to using, and I just could not get used to it. Every time I tried, I would get super frustrated and rage quit. So recently I was doing some research about it just to see what other artists do in order to get used to it, and I saw some people mention this paper-like textured screen protector. And I did realize that one of the things that was super annoying about the iPad for me to draw on was the glass-like surface that it just felt like there was just something about it that felt off, that I really didn't like the feel, and I think that was like one of the biggest deterring factors for me in using it. So I got this paper-like screen protector, and honestly it was a complete game changer because the gritty texture of the screen protector really kind of made it feel like I'm drawing directly on the surface, and it was actually really close to paper, I would say, obviously, like, so it was pretty much as advertised. The only thing I'm gonna say is that it did shave off my pencil tip, like my Apple pencil tip, down to the metal, which is now showing, but I don't know, it seems to be functioning right now. The shaving off happened pretty quickly, maybe within like, I'm gonna say 12 or 13 hours of use altogether with the screen protector, so that's kind of concerning. But I did look up the tip replacements from Apple, and they seem to be pretty affordable. I think it's like 25 bucks for a pack of 4 or something, but anyways. So yeah, the second attempt since getting the paper screen is this drawing. So during my first attempt, I essentially just drew something real quick to see if I can duplicate my Photoshop process, and I was also making a bunch of my own brushes just to experiment with what it can do, because brushes was a pretty big area of concern for me. But anyways, I might still keep tweaking them, and at some point I might just upload them for you guys to use as well if you want, but I'm still kind of in the process of figuring out how to optimize them to get them to act the way that I want them specifically. So yeah, I recorded this whole process from scratch, and I'm really excited to share it with you because obviously I captured the whole sketching process, which is something I rarely do. And so like I mentioned before, the struggle with using the iPad was real for me, and this is actually a great time to tell you guys about the sponsor of this video, which is Skillshare. So, in case some of you haven't heard of Skillshare before, it's an online learning platform that has a ton of classes for creative people who love learning new skills or are just curious about all things artistic and creative. The list of classes on Skillshare is ever growing, with new ones being added every day, and you can choose from thousands of classes on topics like illustration, animation, creative writing, freelance, and more. The ones I just mentioned are specifically super interesting to me, so I'm really excited to check some of them out. So I mentioned earlier that my struggle with Procreate and iPad was brutal, so I decided to be proactive and actually learn the basics from someone with experience who can explain things properly. So I did a quick search and found a Skillshare original class called Digital Illustration Learn to Use Procreate by Jerem Vogel, and it was so helpful. This class is relatively short, about an hour, so it was really easy for me to make time for it, and it helped me to finally break through this huge block I had with Procreate. What I loved about this class is that it quickly went over all the main features of the program or app in a clear and concise way, and it's also broken down into small chunks so that it's super easy to go back and rewatch a segment if you forget something, which is actually what I ended up doing while I was drawing this illustration. So there are so many hidden things in Procreate I would have never found without this help, and I highly recommend this class if you feel stuck like I was. I should also mention that I do have my own Skillshare class on the platform that is about character illustration. You can find it if you look up Cosmic Spectrum, and there I just go over my detailed process and the tools that I use and all the little steps that I take in creating my character illustrations. The membership for Skillshare is super affordable, being less than $10 a month for an annual membership, and you can give it a try for free. The first 1,000 of my subscribers to click the link in the description will get a free 2-month trial of a premium Skillshare membership so you can explore your creativity. And now back to the video. So unfortunately, I didn't get to record my hands on the iPad for the entirety of the video because my phone was being finicky and it was dying, and I actually ran out of memory, so the rest of the video just has the iPad footage, and I think I have like another small chunk that I switched to at some point. And I apologize in advance if you can hear my cat having a snack in the background. But yeah, so I wanted to tell you guys a little bit about the first chunk of the video that I had at the beginning that I kind of talked about other things over top of. So in that chunk where I was drawing the faces in my sketchbook, I was just basically taking a little bit of time to get to know the characters, and that's actually something I do most of the time when I do character design or something similar. I just draw a headshot, and that honestly gives me so much more room to work with when it comes to drawing characters. I feel like I get a good sense of their personality from just drawing the faces slash heads or whatever once. So that's basically what I was doing there, just a little bit of exploration to see if I could zero in on the personalities of the three characters. And so one of my biggest goals in this was trying to retain as much of the original as possible, because it wouldn't be as fun if I changed a bunch of things. Like, I think I've seen some artists redraws where they end up changing so much of the original illustration that it just looks like something entirely new. So in this one in particular, I was very concerned about making sure that it still looks like just a different version of essentially the same artwork, so that's pretty much what I was going for. And yeah, as you can see here, I redraw the legs like a million times. This actually seems to be like some sort of recurring issue for me. I noticed in a bunch of other drawings that I've done where I recorded the process that I draw like one leg or like both legs a billion times over and over again until I get it right. And this is actually something I wanted to mention. So this happens largely because I am not used to using references, so my typical go-to process is to just sit down and start drawing and just figure things out as I go, which is exactly what I did here, and that's why it took forever for me to get the angle right. But I do think it's really good practice, and I think maybe one thing I should have done is probably just take a pose in the mirror and take a photo of that angle for the boots or the shoes or whatever, because I think that would have actually saved me quite a bit of time. But regardless, I managed to get it to a point where I could let it go and move on to the next step, which is figuring out the outfits. So I actually skipped one chunk of the process because I erased the whole thing, but it took me a little bit of time to get things to a point where I was okay with them. I actually can't say that I was like 100% happy with the result, but I had to just move on because I wasn't gonna spend forever trying to design these outfits that I'm only gonna draw once. So yeah, one of the things that actually I didn't like about it specifically is that it's got like a very fantasy feel, which is originally what I was going for, but it's been so long since I've done any sort of fantasy type of character design. Everything I've been doing for the past several years has been super like practical, so I think I generally prefer to do more like practical character designs that are based on real garments instead of just completely making things up. But this can be fun too, so I digress. So near the end of the sketch, I was probably the least happy with the girl on screen left, the one whose design is actually, she's the only one of these three whose design is based off of an actual flower, which is Lily of the Valley. The other two are just like a nondescript red flower and the yellow flower, so I just kind of went with it. I suppose I could have like googled an actual flower to base their designs off, but I don't know. Like I said, I was more concerned with like preserving the original feel of the design, so I didn't bother. But yeah, so at this point I'm actually at my favorite step, and what you saw just now was me drawing on the wrong layer, so I had to do it over again. But yeah, so inking is usually my favorite, well, one of my favorite steps for sure in the process of an illustration, because I feel like it's the time where you can finally just polish everything and make it look exactly like I want to, which is why I enjoy it so much. I know that this is actually kind of uncommon. I noticed that in the art community and with like most of my friends, they really don't like, they don't seem to like inking, and it's like their least favorite step in the process. But I don't know, I don't really get it. I've always liked inking the best. It's always been my favorite, and I find it significantly less frustrating than trying to find all the right shapes in the sketching process. So for this drawing, I was still, well, and probably will be for the next few, in the experimental stage where I'm still trying to like find the brushes that work best for me and try different things. Like for this one specifically, I zeroed in on the 6B brush that I think was in a brush pack that I purchased a while back. I think it's a Max pack, like Max I don't know if you know who I'm talking about, but there's this illustrator who makes really nice traditional media brush packs for Procreate, Max Ulichny. I'm gonna mention it in my description if you're interested. But yeah, so I bought a couple of his brush packs, which are pretty good, although there are a lot of brushes that I'm not sure if I would ever get any use out of, but that tends to be my problem in general. Like, that was actually one of the first things that I thought were kind of like disappointing to me about Procreate. I feel like I just couldn't find, like, I really loved how so many of the brushes feel and type of effects that they make, but I just couldn't find any use for them. I don't know how to explain it any better than that, but anyways, so this 6B brush worked really well for me. It actually has a very, very similar look to my go-to brush in Photoshop, so I'm super happy that I found it and I can use it from now on. And yeah, as you can see, I don't rely much on the free transform tools and stuff like that. Like, I will move an element a little bit here and there, but when it comes to modifying the stuff that I've already drawn, I just like to erase and do it over again, and I do that until I get it right. And I actually think that's one of the reasons why, as you can see, I don't have to undo a lot of things frequently, and I can usually get the right line from the first or second try. I mean, it really depends on what I'm doing, but most of the time I can do it pretty quickly, which is why I like inking so much, because it doesn't take me too long and it pulls everything together and really cleans up the image. So yeah, I also wanted to mention that when it comes to my process, I'm really not into ugly stages, if you know what I'm talking about. So those of you who do lineless painting and like digital painting in general will probably know that like there's always a stage which people refer to as the ugly stage, where you just have to get through it and then eventually your artwork will start looking great. Well, I do not have the patience for the ugly stage, which is exactly why I kind of cater to myself when I come up with a process. And the process that I use specifically, what you're looking at right now, is the brief ugly stage that I do have to deal with, which is essentially putting down the flat colors. So you may have noticed in my other digital work that I really prefer colored lines. I haven't used black line work in ages. I feel like when I was maybe like 18, or I think maybe I was like 19 or something, so I guess at least like 10 years ago, somebody told me about the lock pixel thing, like the alpha lock or pixel lock, if you know what I'm talking about. It's like a function that you can do on the layer where you lock the pixels and you can just like draw over it, and the new color won't go outside the lines. So ever since somebody told me about that function, I never used black line work ever again. I just absolutely fell in love with the look that it gives, just like this softness and such a nice color harmony where you can go and pick, like, usually what I do is I'll do all the flats first and like get the general sense of the colors that I want to use, and then I'll go into the line art and essentially color in all the lines with a soft, slightly darker shade of the base color of whatever element. And this is what concludes the ugly stage of the drawing, and from then on is pretty much smooth sailing. So yeah, that's something that I personally really like about my process, because it just lets me enjoy pretty much every minute of it. In fact, I am planning to, like, when I do end up working on my comic that I'm really itching to work on, and I'm working on the script right now, I actually want to hire somebody to do the flats for me, because it's the one part that is super like time consuming and kind of boring that I think somebody else could do, hopefully, that I can just pay them to. But I digress. Anyways, so at this point you can see I'm just finishing up the flat colors and coloring in the line work. I do go back and forth a little bit, like if something just looks too dark, I'll go and pick a lighter color and adjust based on what the whole of the image looks like. And usually the last part that I do when it comes to flats is the makeup and like facial details. It's one of my favorite parts, which is why I leave it for last, because usually by the time I get to it I'm a little bit frustrated and tired of this particular step, so it's like a little bit of a break that is putting on makeup on their faces. So yeah, and I'll usually like change around the colors of the eyelashes and such, and like the lips, just to match whatever makeup I decided to put on them. And I also put some blush. I mean, okay, this is not exactly makeup, but it's more like I don't even know what it's called, but you know how people essentially have more blood concentration in certain areas, like the cheeks, the nose, and maybe the chin, also like tips of fingertips and such. So that's essentially what I was doing here. So you could also call it blush, but I also put it on the nose and on like some other body parts. It's a little bit aesthetic, a little bit accurate, I guess. I don't know. I usually try to like toe the line between technically correct and just aesthetically pleasing. I'm not like too concerned with the technicalities, so hopefully that's okay. And yeah, so the last part that's kind of like the biggest nuisance is the transparency that I just really wanted to put on the skirts, and that just requires some layer like switcheroos where you have to go back and forth, and like usually how I go about it is just using like an eraser, but setting it to a lower opacity so I can just erase some of the lines so they become transparent, and then I'll make a new layer underneath and draw whatever can be seen under the skirt, or whichever transparent element underneath the line layer. So yeah, and this is one of the last steps, and this is probably the most the step that makes the most visual difference, because as you can see, the image was relatively flat up until I started doing this, which is the shadows. So I like to do a shadow pass first and then a highlight pass afterwards. So I know that it's pretty common for people to, especially for like digital painting and lineless painting, for people to work on everything simultaneously, which I do think is a really good method, but I think it's just faster for me personally to do one thing at a time, and it's easier for my brain to like comprehend it, so I don't have to think about other things while I'm doing it. So what I generally do is I will just make one layer on top of everything, and as you can see, it's masked out. So thanks to that Skillshare class, I learned how to use masks finally. I actually have no idea how to use masks on Photoshop. I just end up doing it like a weird backwards way, but man, it's so much easier in in Procreate that I'm really thinking of like using it as often as I can from now on, because I did end up discovering that there's a bunch of things about it that just makes life a lot easier than in Photoshop. So yeah, what I essentially used was this clipping mask tool, where you can set one layer to be the reference layer, and then everything on top is you clip it to the layer below. I don't know if you guys know what I'm talking about, but I'm sure you can find like a quick tutorial for this. But yeah, it makes this shading / lighting, shadows, whatever process step super easy. So I just set it to like 55, maybe like up to 60 opacity on multiply, and I usually pick like a dark red, like a dark deep burgundy type of color, and do all the shadows just in that one color. And I'm only relying on hard versus soft edges. And as you can see, I use like a blending tool, which is a modification of a smudge brush that I spent quite some time on before I started this illustration. That was one of my biggest concerns, because so I have like a custom brush like this that I made in Photoshop that I've been using for years, and it's such a big part of my process that I honestly couldn't figure out how to like do it without a brush specifically like this. So I spent like a couple of hours experimenting in Procreate, and I finally was able to recreate the type of brush that I use in Photoshop, and I actually think like the Procreate one is slightly better than the one I have in Photoshop. I think the Procreate brush studio, or the tool that lets you experiment and make your own brushes, is really great. It seems super powerful, and although it is very complicated and I still don't know what half of the things do, even though I watched a couple of tutorials at this point, I still want to keep trying to like get the hang of it so I can make new brushes of my own. So yeah, as you can see, this brush that I'm using is it's kind of like a soft blend that just like feathers out the edges or whatever area I'm working on. I guess you could kind of compare it to like a smudge stick for a graphite pencil on paper. It behaves very similarly to that, and if you've ever used one of those things, you'd know how amazing and quickly you can get your shadows down. So yes, at this point I'm pretty much finishing up the shadow pass, and sometimes I will do a second one just to really go hard on the darker areas, because 60% or whatever I usually set it to sometimes is not enough, but it usually really depends on the type of lighting, and here it's like pretty generic, like it's standard, there's nothing complicated going on. So after I finished the first pass, what I did was I locked the pixels, like did the alpha lock thing on the layer, and just added a bunch of new colors into the mix. So like I mentioned, I used like a dark burgundy for the base, but I wanted to add more interest into the dark areas, so I was just like picking random colors and just to see what it would look like in the shadows. Yeah, and once I was happy with the result, I was finally able to move on to my favorite part, which is adding some highlights. Sometimes in order to expedite the process and when I just really want to finish quickly, I would use the burn and dodge tool a bit in between these two steps, but since I wanted to retain like the really textured organic look, I decided to avoid using the harsh looking burn and dodge, and I just went in with like, I'm trying to remember which brush I used for this. I think it was just the same brush that I inked with, like the 6B pencil brush. When I do the highlights in Photoshop, I usually use the same brush that I ink with as well, so that's super easy. One other brush that I use a lot in Photoshop is like a speckled type of brush, which I was pretty easily able to find an equivalent in Procreate. I think there's actually a ton more textured brushes in Procreate that I can experiment on. So yeah, at this point what you're looking at is me just putting on essentially the icing on the cake. Most of the work is done, and I'm just kind of polishing up certain parts, and is obviously adding highlights, as you can see. So one thing I wanted to mention that I really like about the result in Procreate is that the end product ends up having a lot more texture than my Photoshop end product does, and I wasn't even entirely aware of that until I specifically compared them side by side, like this drawing and another one I did that was super polished and finished in Photoshop of my two characters, Sweet and Zero, for the holographic print that I did for the release of my art book. I think you guys know what I'm talking about. It's like the banner on my YouTube, like my main YouTube page. So yeah, I noticed that, like, man, the texture difference is huge. So and that's something I really like. I'm not a huge fan of the super like sleek, shiny, digital type of look, so that made me very happy, and I'm honestly very excited to use Procreate more now that I finally zeroed in a process that actually has good results, and it seems pretty reliable. So the reason why I say that is because the last like several times that I tried to use Procreate, I felt like I was getting different results every time, and that's mostly because I was kind of being too lazy and I didn't put in the the proper work that I needed to in order to just learn how to use the program. And just the fact that it was like pretty different from Photoshop is what kept throwing me off, because I just always expect everything to be exactly like Photoshop for some reason. But yeah, I'm happy that I finally got around to learning how to use it, and I can't wait to make more artwork with it. So on that note, yeah, I wanted to thank you guys for watching this video. I really hope you liked it. I did put a lot more effort into editing this one than I usually do, and I had a lot of fun doing it. And also I am very, very thankful to the sponsor of this video, which is again Skillshare. And I'm happy to tell you guys that thanks to the sponsorship, I feel super motivated to be more on schedule with releasing new videos from now on, and I'm planning to do 1 video per week. So yeah, I really hope I can keep to that schedule. It seems doable, and I do have a ton of footage that I have yet to edit. And yes, so I just wanted to mention again that there is a link down below where you can sign up for a free 2-month trial of Skillshare. And if you like this video and want to see more like it, please do like it and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!